Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to Cairns. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners. That's become a bit of a ritual, and even Queensland politicians these days, or at least up until about 2 weeks ago, used to acknowledge traditional owners. But I think it's particularly important if we're talking about sustainability, because as we've just been reminded, the original Australians developed social practices and approaches that allowed them to live in balance with natural systems for tens of thousands of years. And that's a lesson that I'd suggest to you we whitefellas haven't yet learnt, that sustainability is, as we were just reminded, about survival. I also want to thank CAFNEC for organising this and for their wonderful work over the years. It's more than 30 years, I know, because 35 years ago CAFNEC hosted me to speak in this city about some of the issues that we're still talking about today. And I want to acknowledge the presence here today of my ACF colleagues who've been doing wonderful work in far north Queensland with the traditional owners and other land users as part of the Cape York Indigenous land reform process, which we hope will still go on in spite of recent political changes. I want to start, if I can figure out how to work this. No, I've actually failed the IQ test. I was involved in a process a few years ago with the region of Geelong, thinking about their future, and they ended by developing this vision of where they wanted to go. They wanted the region to be internationally renowned for its vibrant, cohesive communities, exceptional national environment, an economy with sustainable inputs and outputs, a resilience in the face of a rapidly changing global economy, society and environment. I'm not saying that that's an ideal vision that every region should have, but I think the crucial thing is to develop a vision for your region. The old saying is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. But if you do know where you're going, you can make positive decisions to steer in that direction. Now, I've gone backwards. Now I've really done it. Okay, the fundamental premise of what I'm talking about is that the future is not somewhere we're going, but something we're creating. We all do things every day that make some futures more likely and other futures less likely. I think it's obvious that from the wide range of possible futures, we should be trying to choose one that is at least in principle sustainable, able to be sustained. I mean, call me a nitpicking academic pedant if you like, but I think sustainability means ability to be sustained, if not forever, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, I've recently dusted off, in the light of political changes in Queensland, an exercise I did a few years ago, where I imagined I'd been commissioned by the government's new Ministry for Unsustainable Development to recommend some policies that would ensure that our future was not sustainable. I'll just go through this very rapidly. If you were wanting to ensure that the future was unsustainable, you'd have rapid population growth, you'd have increasing consumption per person, you would deplete significant mineral resources, especially oil, and to ensure that had maximum impact, you'd base your entire transport system around an implicit presumption that there will always be cheap transport fuels. You would overuse renewable resources like water and fisheries and forests. You would do significant environmental damage, disrupt the climate, lose biodiversity, and what's dropped off the bottom of the slide, you base your economy around a presumption that every year you extract larger and larger quantities of raw materials and produce ever-increasing volumes of waste. In social terms, you would increase inequality between the haves and the have-nots, perhaps by embracing globalisation, so you would drive wages in labour-intensive areas down to compete with third-world sweatshops, and you would inflate managerial salaries to telephone numbers to give us the world's best talent, which we see exemplified in management successes like Telstra and Qantas and OneTel and HIH. And if you wanted to compound the impact of widening income inequality, you would steadily run down the public provision of essential services like education and health and transport in favour of a private provider model that meant that those with heavier wallets had better access to the goods and services we need. And finally, as a spiritual basis for your society, you would embrace crass materialism and encourage people to believe that they will be more fulfilled if they have the largest plasma TV or the largest four-wheel drive vehicle in the street. I won't insult your intelligence by going through them one by one, but I will suggest that if a visit from another galaxy happened upon our civilization on a reconnaissance mission, they would conclude that despite the rhetoric about sustainability, we actually had in place all of the policy settings you would have if you wanted to ensure that your future was not sustainable. And remarkably, we seem not to have noticed the disconnect between what we were saying and the policies we have. At one level, there's nothing new about what I'm saying. UNEP has now produced 4 reports in the series on the global environmental outlook, and the second one said our present approach is unsustainable. Postponing action is no longer an option, although it was the inevitable political response. I've said our situation is a bit like this picture. Our politicians focus on the road ahead and make small decisions, and they're oblivious about the large-scale problems coming up behind them. And if you can't see the fine print, it says objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. At the national level, the Australian Bureau of Statistics responded to criticism from ratbags like me in the 1980s that they collected economic data and published them on the assumption that economic data about wealth per person were a surrogate indicator of quality of life. And they started their program Measures of Australia's Progress in 1990, collecting data on headline indicators in the 3 areas of the economic, the social and the environmental. And successive reports have all demonstrated that since 1990, all of the economic indicators are positive, the social indicators are mixed, some getting better, some getting worse, and all the significant environmental indicators are going south. So the logical conclusion is that our increasing wealth is coming at some social cost and at significant environmental cost, and that is clearly not sustainable. Let me just mention a couple of specific problems. This is the latest graph, well, it's now nearly 10 years old, but it still hasn't impinged on the consciousness of most decision makers, from the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. What it shows is that the peak of conventional oil production has already happened. Oil supplies are being augmented by heavy oil, by oil from deep water, and we know that there's no technical or environmental problems with that, don't we? Oil from the polar regions and gas condensates, but the overall peak, if it hasn't already happened, will happen sometime in the next 5 years, and after that it's downhill all the way. Yet we're still seeing examples like this. This is a proposal for a new transport development on the Sunshine Coast where I live, and it's worrying that the current newly installed Queensland Premier, when he was Lord Mayor of Brisbane, engaged in an unprecedented orgy of building roads and tunnels and bridges as if that was the solution to transport problems. The inevitable conclusion is that transport fuels will become steadily more expensive, but at least as likely supply disruptions will be more likely to occur. And that doesn't just have significance for the obvious role of transport fuels in moving people around. Petroleum fuels are a key parameter that enables us to produce and distribute food, to manufacture and distribute other goods. And so, just as in the 1970s, when the world price of oil increased from less than $2 a barrel to the unthinkable $30 a barrel, and that caused a ripple of inflation that went right through the whole economy and caused most elected governments in the Western world to be voted out by angry people, so we will see the inflationary pressures caused by transport fuels becoming inevitably more expensive ripple through the entire economy and critically affect things like the food production system, and I'll return to that a bit later. The obvious principles of sustainable resource use, we all know: reduce, reuse, recycle. We know we need to move to clean energy supply, and there'll be people talking about that later today. But the crucial point about energy is to move to more efficient use. As Amory Lovins famously said, people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. They want the services that energy allows us to have. When I have a shower in the morning, it doesn't make any difference to the quality of my shower whether the water has been heated by the sun's energy, as it has been at my house for nearly 30 years, or if it's produced by burning dirty coal, putting carbon dioxide in the air, transmitting that energy hundreds of kilometres, warming the wires and warming the ambient air along the way, and then turned inefficiently into hot water at the site. The National Framework for Energy Efficiency, published by the Howard government nearly 10 years ago, said we could reduce our carbon dioxide emissions 30% by measures that have a payback time of less than 4 years. And it's a scandal that we still haven't implemented those measures that are good for the economic bottom line as well as for the environment. The crucial driving force is to internalise costs, and it's probably a significant political problem that the minimalist price on carbon dioxide pollution, which is probably not large enough to drive the rapid transition we need, is still being attacked by the forces of darkness, who absurdly call it the world's largest carbon tax, when in fact it's about 1/5 of the charge on carbon in more progressive economies. Let me say something briefly about ecological integrity. This is the bottom line, humanity's overall ecological footprint. When I was an undergraduate, humanity used about half of the sustainable productivity of natural systems. Today we use about 130% of the sustainable productivity of natural systems. In other words, we are operating at an ecological deficit, and we see the cost of that in diminishing biodiversity and in the degradation of the Earth's natural systems. The Millennium Assessment quantified the unprecedented changes in my lifetime. More land has been converted to cropland since 1945 than in the 18th and 19th centuries combined. 20% of the world's reefs have been lost and another 20% degraded, which is why it's critically important to maintain the Great Barrier Reef, an outstanding natural asset, and why it's a scandal that people are talking seriously not about reducing pollution of the reef lagoon, but about changing the boundaries so that we can continue to pollute an area by saying it's no longer in the World Heritage Area. 35% of mangroves have been lost in recent decades. The amount of water in reservoirs has quadrupled since 1960, as around the world we've built large dams at the rate of about 1 a day, and the water taken out of rivers and lakes for irrigation mainly has doubled in that period. We are also now a significant agent of change to the biogeochemical cycles of the planet. Most people, except the editor of The Australian and a few professors of geology, now understand that our interference in the carbon cycle is changing the Earth's climate. But our interference in the other natural cycles is probably at least as important. Since 1960, the flows of biologically available nitrogen in terrestrial systems has doubled, and the flows of phosphorus have tripled. Humans now produce more biologically available nitrogen than all natural systems put together. And the drive to produce more for an increasing population means the UN estimates we may be producing 65% more available nitrogen by 2050. I don't want to depress you, but the Millennium Assessment said that there's an increasing likelihood that our impact on natural systems will produce non-linear changes that will push natural systems beyond some critical tipping points where they will change rapidly and irreversibly to a different stable state. And they quoted half a dozen recent examples. The best known is the Newfoundland cod fishery, which was harvested more or less sustainably at about 250,000 tonnes a year for about 100 years, until better technology made it possible briefly to catch about 3 times as much fish. The fishery collapsed, there was a minor recovery, and then it collapsed completely. And it's a warning that we need to take a precautionary approach in dealing with natural systems, because we are still pretty ignorant about the long-term impact and the irreversible impact of changes we're making. So we should have as our absolute bottom line protection of the integrity of ecological systems. We should be concerned for biological diversity because we simply don't understand the consequence of losing individual species. We need more and better managed nature and biosphere reserves, and we need particular emphasis on protecting endangered species and threatened ecosystems. And that means not just that we need more national parks in Queensland than we now have, it means that we need a proper budget allocation to ensure that they're sensibly managed to maintain their natural values. The critical point is improving our understanding of natural systems. I was involved in the workshop that developed the principles of so-called sustainability science, and what shocked us was realising how much environmental damage has been done by the direct application of narrow technical knowledge to one part of a system in ignorance of its wider implications. We urgently need to develop a much better understanding of the complexity of natural systems and our impacts on them. so that we can make better informed decisions to meet our needs with less risk to perturbing the natural systems of the planet. Let me say something briefly about social and economic justice. The Millennium Assessment said we should be trying to eradicate poverty, should be committed to equitable development, we should be aiming at gender equity, and we should ensure that everyone can live in human dignity, however carelessly they've chosen their parents, or however carelessly those parents have chosen where they live. I won't go through all those in detail, but equitable development certainly means equitable distribution within and between nations. We need to ensure that trade supports sustainable resource use, environmental protection and labour standards, where at the moment it doesn't support any of those, and that means we need transparent, accountable organisations. Anyone who thinks the World Trade Organisation is transparent and accountable, I want to know what you're smoking and where I can get some. I was part of the Australian delegation to the UNESCO World Congress on Science in the year 2000, and we said that we should be aiming to see this century as not just a new century, but a just new century, one in which it is the aim of our policies to ensure that all humans on Earth have the basics of clean drinking water, adequate nutrition, reasonable shelter, basic health care and education. While that seems a huge challenge, I wanted to point out that the UN Development Programme did a study about 10 years ago and concluded that providing every human on Earth with those basics would cost a massive sum, about 5% of the global military budget. In other words, it doesn't require anything as naive as peace breaking out universally, but it would only require trimming a small amount off the literally obscene sums that we spend preparing to fight each other over the limited resources of the planet to ensure that everybody on Earth could live in human dignity. Earlier this year, the UN Secretary-General released the report Resilient People, Resilient Planet, the report of his high-level panel on global sustainability. It was co-chaired by the presidents of Finland and South Africa. There were politicians, scientists and economists from a wide range of countries. The Australian representative was one K.M. Rudd, who was described as a former Prime Minister. I've often wondered what happened to him. The summary of the key issues in their report was that we live at unprecedented levels of material prosperity, but the planet is under unprecedented stress. And despite the unprecedented prosperity, more than 1 billion people still live in poverty, meaning that they have a cash income of less than $1 a day. And they said the current development model is clearly unsustainable. They said we need to recognise the new nexus between food and water and energy and develop integrated thinking that doesn't deal with issues separately in silos, but recognises the interrelation between them. That means, it said, we need new sustainability indicators and policy linked to science rather than forms of organised superstition like economics. Let me say something briefly about those critical three factors: energy, water and food. In terms of energy, the International Energy Agency, in their report on the World Energy Outlook in 2008, said the combination of peak oil and climate change means the world now needs, and I quote, nothing short of an energy revolution. That means, as you'll be told later today, that we should be looking positively at the realistic prospect of developing clean energy systems, rather than talking in short-sighted terms about trying to wriggle out of contracts that commit Queensland to developing solar energy systems, or about trying to expand the infrastructure for mining and exporting ever larger quantities of coal. Again, I don't think that even makes economic sense unless you really believe that people will be buying and burning our coal in 30 years' time. We need an energy revolution to develop clean energy systems and more efficient ways of transforming them into the services that people want. In terms of water, it's clearly critical for survival to have clean drinking water, but water is also a critical input to our food supply, whether we're producing vegetable material or animal protein, and it's a crucial input to production because all manufactured goods like steel, motor vehicles, white goods and so on, all require huge quantities of processed water for their production. And the problem is globally that the supply is declining as rainfall patterns change with global climate change, and in areas where they rely on melting glaciers, glaciers are retreating. There is a clear link to warming, and the problem is that more people means greater needs and less resources. So we have to learn to do more with less. The traditional approach has been to augment the water supply by damming rivers, and as I mentioned, we're still building dams at the rate of about one a day, and there are still people not a million miles from George Street, Brisbane, who think that building large dams is a good idea. The problem is that there are fewer promising sites, even if you believe in that old approach characterised by a friend of mine with the phrase "white man speak with forklift truck," that you can solve problems just by applying more horsepower. We now recognise the social and ecological impacts of building reservoirs. I think we need to think much more creatively about run-of-the-river extraction, maybe desalination with renewable energy, but the crucial point is more effective use of water. Just as people don't want energy, they don't want water as itself, they want the things that water allows us to produce. And much of our use of water is still embarrassingly inefficient. I recently drove through the Murrumbidgee Valley in the context of the dispute about reducing the irrigation water extracted from the Murray-Darling system. And I saw water still flowing through shallow open channels from the river to farms, water when it gets to the farms being sprayed into the air so that some lands on roads, some lands on soil, some evaporates in the air, and a small amount gets to the roots of the crop system. There are advanced modern technologies. I commend one called the pipe, which was invented about 2,000 years ago by the Romans, so it's had a fair field trial, and dramatically reduces evaporative losses. The crucial point is that we need to make much more effective use of water. Amory Lovins famously said, if you can't fill the sink because the water keeps running out, you don't need a bigger tap, you need a plug. And we urgently need to look at more effective use of water rather than getting more of it. In terms of food, the UN estimates that we'll need 50% more by 2030. I'm not sure we need 50% more, but if the population keeps growing, we'll certainly need more food. And the problem is that we're losing productive land to urban expansion and past unsustainable use. We have probably less available water in many parts of the world, and oil will become scarcer and more expensive. So more needs to be produced with less resources. Again, storage and distribution are crucial because a lot of food disappears between the paddock and the plate, but the global situation is very worrying, and I think it's obvious that there will be a world food problem within the next decade. We need to think of the linkages, and this was the point that the UN report made, because food production requires energy and water. Water supply requires energy because a cubic metre of water weighs a tonne, so we spend huge amounts of energy not just processing water but shifting it around from where it is to where it's needed. And energy supply in most forms requires water, so we can't deal with the problems in separation. We need integrated approaches that look at all of the problems together. The UN report said the drivers of the challenge are unsustainable lifestyles, production and consumption patterns, and the impacts of population growth. So it's a real challenge to get back into balance, but we really have no option but to face that challenge. As we were told in the previous presentation, it's about survival. Jared Diamond's book Collapse is subtitled How Societies Choose to Fail or Survive, and his fundamental point is that societies naturally expand until they reach some form of limits. It may be energy or other resources, it may be water, it may be food, it may be relations with their neighbours. And whether they survive or collapse, Jared Diamond says, depends on whether they're able to adjust to get back into balance, or whether they march bravely into the night doing what they've always done as things fall apart around them. And history is littered with examples of societies that did not meet that challenge and did not survive. But every challenge is an opportunity. The main point for policy, the UN report said, is integrating environmental and social issues into economic decisions. That's vital for success, to bring the sustainable development paradigm into mainstream economics, recognising that the cost of inaction far outweighs the cost of action. Let me give you two quotes about the need to change our economic approach. The UK Sustainability Commission said a macro economy predicated on continual expansion of debt-driven materialistic consumption is unsustainable ecologically, problematic socially and unstable economically, which of course is why it's so popular. In case you think that that's the sort of thing that a Sustainability Commission would say, and real economists wouldn't say that, the World Economic Forum held a summit on the global agenda in 2008, and their final statement said, "The recent crises of fuel, food and finance are simply the three canaries in the mine, the early warning signals that our current economic system is simply not sustainable." And the UN report said that there are four fundamental flaws in current economic approaches. Firstly, they're unsustainable because they allow, or in some cases actually promote, overconsumption and degradation of resources. Secondly, they're unfair because they multiply financial advantage. And again, there's nothing new about that. Adam Smith documented in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 how the allocation of any limited resource through a market will always exacerbate inequality. Thirdly, they're unstable. They lack resilience in a time of growing volatility and rapid change. And finally, they're undemocratic. There is inadequate democratic control and accountability, which we've seen demonstrated dramatically in Australia in recent years by the increasing power of a few tycoons in the mining industry and their ability to make and unmake governments and demand that policies be shaped in their interest rather than those of the community. The UN report said the new economics must have two features. It must fully realise individual potential through advancement of human rights, including the right to thriving livelihoods, quality education and effective social safety nets, and it must protect and nurture the richness of the natural world in ways that confront and rectify intensifying threats to humans and other species. A modest challenge. So, what will a sustainable community look like? I believe this should be our target: to stabilise our population and footprint, to use resources sustainably to produce a dynamic and flexible economy, to be approaching a zero-waste society, to have drastically cut carbon emissions, to require new developments to be biodiversity positive, to be committed to improving equality, and that means that we need serious triple bottom line assessments rather than detailed economic assessments, superficial environmental assessments and no social assessments at all. And that means we need a proper process for difficult decisions. That means the entire community is involved in taking hard decisions. The entire community owns the process of moving forward. I started by giving you this example from the region of Geelong, a vision, internationally renowned, vibrant, cohesive communities, exceptional natural environment, an economy with sustainable inputs and outputs, resilience in the face of rapid change. And I suggested that that's an example of the sort of vision that's sensible for each region to develop. The fundamental point is that there are many challenges to develop sustainably. We face the challenges of peak oil, of the decline of natural systems, of climate change, of water and food production, of population growth and economic system. But I'm told that the Chinese translation of our word crisis consists of two of their characters, one meaning danger and the other meaning opportunity. And I think that's quite a perceptive translation, because a crisis is by definition a time of danger. But it also means that business as usual is not an option. It means that you have to act. You have to do something to alleviate the symptoms of the crisis. And in that sense, it's an opportunity, because it allows us to reshape our approaches, to reshape our institutions, to develop new technologies that meet our needs in ways that are less damaging. As I said at the start, we're all engaged in creating the future. It seems to me the crucial step is to develop a coherent vision for your future that's owned by the community, and to make conscious choices to approach that vision. Thank you very much.